All right, this is more for the people that are going to be in here this afternoon, because I won't be here to answer any questions, but I'm kind of getting tired of the same questions from about 20 different students. I'm going to answer the same thing for you. In a minute, we're going to look at some notes. I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. And your job today, Macon, while I'm doing all of this, is you're looking at any of the people and events that I talk about, or the people and events and the notes that you read about, because I'm not getting through 55 slides in one class. And you're going to then write your own newspaper about it. Now, in here, you have two choices of newspapers. You have an old-looking paper, or you have a Harry Potter paper now again, I don't care which one you choose. I'm going to choose the Daily Prophet from Harry Potter. So here's what it would look like when I open it up. Make sure you're paying attention back there in that middle table that aren't looking this way. Now, you'll see that everything here is blank. And on this page, there's a bunch of really funny words written down. When you see that lorem ipsum dolor, it's just a placeholder, Josie. All they're doing is showing you where you could put your words. If you don't like the way this page is set up, grab a blank page. And at the very bottom here, they actually have the things that you can use to decorate the page any way that you want to. You just have to copy that and move it to where you want it if that's what you want to do. That's up to you. I'm lazy. I'm going to go ahead and use this page layout and this page layout. You literally click in the box. I would get rid of the underlining and start typing your words. Ali, if you notice that it's spacing words really weird, mess with the width of the box. It'll change it back to the way it's supposed to be. Or just delete it and put your own text box, Brayley, and you'll be fine. Is putting the things in this newspaper something that anybody else has a question about? It's your choice. Do you have to use the Daily Prophet? No, you can use this one, which honestly has less stuff. And it might be easier for somebody to understand, oh, I write things in here. Now, Paisley's looking at this. She's like, I can't read those words. Like, come over here, change the size. Can you read the words now? Well, yeah. I'm just looking at the newspaper blown up 125%. You can change that to whatever you need to change it to so that it's easy for you to read, but they just have it on fit. Any more questions about how to change the newspaper around, or which one do you have to do? Sophia, do you have to do both newspapers? No, you get to pick which one you want to. You are correct. All right, I'm going to pause this. So just to give you a quick preview of what's going on, we started off with the Missouri Compromise at the beginning of these notes, which is on the separate video. And it talks about how that was like kind of the beginning of the North and the South starting to argue over slavery. And the Missouri Compromise, in short, is they decided that they would let one state in to be free and one state in to be slave state so that nobody would have more power, because there were 22 states, 11 free, 11 slave. So they were kind of balancing out the power, and they have this compromise. Then we went through some things that happened, and we talked about Harriet Tubman and a few more things, and we ended up here with Dred Scott. Dred Scott has a very different story than we normally hear about. Most of us know about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. If you don't, that's a shame to be in 5th grade and not know about that. But if you don't, that's okay. We can learn about it. Dred Scott had a very different life. It wasn't like Nat Turner that we talked about this morning, who fought back. He was a slave for a doctor, and a doctor that traveled around to different states. And that was very unusual, because normally slaves stayed at a home place where they worked all the time in that specific spot. Traveling around was not very normal. And during his travels with that doctor, Dred Scott stayed and lived for like decent amounts of times in some states that were free. Then they would travel to some states and they would stay for a while, and those states happened to be slave states. As time went on, the doctor died. And when the doctor died, all of the doctor's property, and slaves were treated as property then, went to his wife. And his wife was a pretty terrible person. She would just loan like people in Dred Scott's family out to just other families in random areas. Oh, you need a kid. Here, take this one. Like, nobody in here would want your family members getting loaned out, never knowing if they were going to return or not, because that would be something that you were not very happy with. Instead of running away like Harriet Tubman, instead of fighting back the way Nat Turner did, Dred Scott decided that he was going to sue, and he was going to take his case to court. And the court case that he brought was, because I lived with this doctor in free states, I should be a free man. And it went to lower courts, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it's probably still one of the most famous court cases of all time. His lawyer argued that because they were slaves and they had lived in free states, that they should be free. The justices, the people that run the Supreme Court, they looked at it and they said, because Dred Scott is not a citizen, he has no right to bring a case to court. I think that was their Weasley way of getting out of saying, wow, you're right. And so, unfortunately, Dred Scott did lose his case. But that started to open up even more people's eyes, where it was like, wow, the South, even when somebody is following the rules, is not going to uphold any rights for slaves. And it started to really put distance between the North and the South as far as their opinions on things went. And it really heightened the tensions that were already getting high. We haven't quite made it, Ava, to that Fort Sumter thing that we talked about the other day. We're not there yet. We kind of went back in time a little bit today. But you're starting to see the tensions building. And the North and the South are starting to realize we don't get along at all. We don't get along at all. We'll come back and watch that video in just a few moments, maybe. So, again, in the lower courts, he won his court case, but every time that he won, it kept getting moved to a higher court. And when it made its way to the Supreme Court is when he lost his case. And again, it says here, you might think this is an awful end. How is that important? Well, it's important because it made him, it made Northerners, it made other African Americans realize that they should start standing up for themselves and making a difference in different things in their lives. The North was made even more aware of just how bad things in the South were, and it made them realize how horribly slaves were treated as far as like loaning people out, the physical abuse, the mental abuse. And then the South started to really dig their heels and saying, we're not budging on this. They weren't officially seceded yet, but you could start to see the seeds of secession being planted here. I don't know what this page is. It's just blank. Moving on. There we go. Frederick Douglass. Should be more Frederick Douglass. Why is there a Frederick Douglass in a plantation? That's weird. Frederick Douglass, maybe because it says it's born on a plantation. He was born on a plantation in Talbot, Maryland. His mom was a slave, and when he was born, because his parents were slaves, he was a slave too. And again, life as a slave is very difficult. Imagine being really young and just taken away from your whole family and sent to another place to stay, or another part of the plantation to stay. He never really saw his mom, who died when he was 10. That's about the age that most of us are, right? Pretty much. And then a few years later, he was sent to another place. We'll come back to that in a little bit. When he was 12, and again, this happened every once in a while that slaves were taught to read, Sophia Auld taught Frederick the alphabet. It was against the law at this point. If we go back into the video we talked about this morning, when you start learning about Nat Turner, that had something to do with that. It was against the law to teach slaves to read, and when Mr. Auld found out, he forbid his wife from continuing to teach Frederick Douglass how to read. But he was very intelligent, and he wanted to learn, and over time, he secretly taught himself to read and write. Once he had learned to read, he read newspapers, articles. He started to study slavery. Very similar to Nat Turner, he started to get this very different view on human rights and the way that every person should be treated. He then took a very big chance and taught other slaves how to read. But this got him into huge trouble. He was moved to another farm where he was beaten by the slave owner in an effort to break his spirit. But this only made Frederick Douglass even stronger in his convictions, in the fact that he wanted to gain his freedom and wanted to teach other people how to read as well. In 1838, kind of like Harriet Tubman, he planned his escape. His is very different, though. She escaped through the woods on the Underground Railroad. He disguised himself as a sailor, and he had some papers that showed that he was actually a free black when he got on the boat. And September 3rd, 1938, he got on the train to the north and arrived in New York. Now, once you got there, if you got past all the other stuff, if you were in a free state, you were now a free man. He married his first wife, Anna Murray, and he took the last name Douglas. In Massachusetts, he met with people that were abolitionists. That's people that wanted to abolish slavery. He began to speak at these meetings. So if you're in a meeting with people that don't like slavery and you start to tell them just how bad it is, it only grounds them in their effort to fight against slavery. He became very famous, but this kind of put him in danger. If you're famous and getting in the newspapers and stuff, your former slave owners could see that and they could come after you and try to take you back. To avoid being captured, he went to Ireland and he went to Britain, where he continued to speak anti-slavery speeches to people there as well. He wrote down his story in an autobiography called The Narrative of a Life of Frederick Douglass. The book became a bestseller. I don't know if we have that in our library here or not. He wrote 2 more stories of his life, including My Bondage and My Freedom and The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. He was very outspoken for women's rights. That's something we haven't heard a lot of up until now. It was more about anti-slavery. He spoke about women's rights, who also did not have the right to vote at that time. He worked with Elizabeth Stanton and some others in New York. During the Civil War, he fought for the rights of black soldiers. When the South announced that they would execute any captured black soldiers, he insisted that President Lincoln respond. Lincoln and him met, and he warned the Confederates that for every Union prisoner killed, he would kill a rebel soldier. And he also was trying to get fair pay for the soldiers in the war as well. And again, we'll come back and watch this video in just a moment so I can get through some more stuff. Who's ever heard of Dr. Augusta? 3 people. Well, time to learn. Again, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Katherine Johnson, Martin Luther King. We've heard about them. There are other people who are not as famous. We'll just put it that way. Because these aren't people that you normally hear about. So we'll talk about Dr. Augusta for certain. He was born to free parents in Virginia. He wanted to be a doctor. Now, you can imagine how hard it was for a black man to be a doctor back then, but it was something that he wanted to do because there were state laws that prohibited the education of black people. But he still learned to read and write. He moved to Maryland, and he worked as a barber while he was pursuing his medical education. Pennsylvania, the University of Pennsylvania wouldn't accept him because he was black, but a faculty member took interest and taught him privately. In 1847, he got married to a Native American. By 1850, they moved to Toronto, Canada, where he was accepted by a medical college, and he received his degree. He was appointed the head of the Toronto Hospital and was in charge of a school. He was a staunch supporter of the anti-slavery movement in the United States. He went back to Baltimore at the beginning of the Civil War, and he wrote Abraham Lincoln offering his services as a surgeon. He received a major's commission as a head surgeon in the infantry, which is like the highest you can be, and it's the highest ranking African-American officer at that time. Things started to get pretty awful. His pay of $7 a month was lower than that of his white colleagues. He wrote Henry Wilson, who raised his pay to the appropriate level. Complaints from white subordinates, people that had to work under him, led Lincoln to transfer him to run a local freedmen's hospital in 1863. Even though the North was fighting against slavery and treating African Americans equals with respect, it was not something that they really did. So I know that they were anti-slavery, but they certainly weren't pro-black by any means. How would someone go to war to make sure a person can be free but still treat them horribly is a good question. But it sets up the struggle of African Americans that would have when the Civil War was over. And we'll get to that as the year comes to an end here. He wrote a letter protesting the segregation on trains when he left Baltimore. And again, you do have to ask, you wonder if Rosa Parks was inspired by him. This video is coming to an end.